Welcome to the 20th Century History series. All podcasts are released under a Creative Commons license and are free for non-commercial use. Each podcast is self-contained and does not require listening to previous episodes. The author is Kim Sonderborg, editor is Philip Bird, and the editor-in-chief is Dr. Liam Brown. All episodes are read by Kim Sonderborg.
Why did Spain have a civil war? The Spanish Civil War, fought from 1936 to 1939, holds a special place in the wars of 20th century Europe. First of all, it was a civil war, with neighbor fighting neighbor and village peasants attacking the local authorities, the priest, the mayor, and the local rich families. Second, this civil war became a war of testing out new ideological directions for Spain, most notably communism, republicanism, and fascism. And thirdly, these ideologies, especially communism and fascism, transformed the civil war into an international one. The support given by Germany and Italy to the fascists, by the USSR to the communists, and by the International Brigade to the Republicans in general injected more soldiers, tanks, and airplanes into the fighting, making it longer and more devastating. The Red Army communists, fighting Italian and German fascists and National Socialists, put the Spanish civilian population in the middle of a proxy war between totalitarian systems which by nature had to destroy the opponent in order to come to right. The Spanish population became the hostages of an international battle, and Spain became the testing ground for the war to come right after it, the Second World War. In this episode, we will investigate the long and short-term causes of the Spanish Civil War. We will see that the situation in Spain reminds us of that of Russia in the 19th century. The question is whether reforms in Spain, as they happened in Russia, might have prevented the Civil War. But first, an overview of the sides fighting the Spanish Civil War: the National Front and the Popular Front. The National Front consisted of monarchists, the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Confederation of Conservative Parties, known as the CETA. The leader of CETA, Schilrup, had fascist leanings and was fascinated by Hitler. In 1933, the Spanish fascist party, the Falange, was formed. It was to a large extent supported by the army and the wealthy land-owning upper class. The Popular Front was a mix of center and left-wing parties. The Republicans, who wanted a liberal Spanish republic, were joined by communists, most notably the POUM or POUM, an ultra-left union of Trotskyists, and the CNT, who were anarchists. Spain was thus divided into two fronts, with a conservative, nationalist and fascist right wing, and a Republican, liberalist and socialist left wing. But this relatively new division was the crystallization of long-term divisions in Spanish society. And these divisions formed the main causes of the Civil War. There were three main long-term causes of the Spanish Civil War. 1. A poor economy. 2. Divisions in society between the rich and the poor. And 3. Regional differences. The economic backwardness came from Spain's gradual decline as a colonial power through the 1800s. In 1823, there were a series of revolutions in the Spanish domains in South America, and in 1898, Spain lost Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. In 1875, the Spanish monarchy had been restored after 7 years of republican rule. But when the last Spanish colony, Morocco, rebelled in 1921 and slaughtered 7,000 Spanish soldiers, it led to a domestic crisis. The last Spanish king, King Alfonso XIII, abdicated in 1931. He left behind a Spain with only one colony, a weak army, and no economic growth, despite rich mineral resources. After the defeat of the Moroccan rebels, General Miguel Primo de Rivera had in 1923 performed a coup d'etat and ran the country as a benign dictatorship under martial law. There was some prosperity, with dams being built for hydroelectricity and improved transport. But throughout the 19th century, Spain had not been able to industrialize as much as the rest of Europe. The region of Catalonia alone was responsible for 87% of Spain's industrial output. Spain was an agricultural country, with 60% of the land being owned by only 4% of the population. There was no middle class to speak of. People were either very rich or very poor. If we should compare the economic causes of the Spanish Civil War, a curious country springs to mind: Russia. Tsarist Russia also developed virtually no industry during the 19th century and was primarily an agricultural country. A handful of nobles owned not only the land but everything on it. Serfdom still existed in Russia and was the basic foundation for the organization of the whole society. Tsar Alexander II tried to modernize the system with the Emancipation Edict of 1861, freeing the serfs but turning them into redemption payers instead. In Spain, the peasants might be free, but they did not own their land. There was a hunger for more land to distribute among the peasants. The division between rich and poor was immense. The divisions in Spanish society were very deep-rooted, almost ancient, and played a large role in brewing causes for conflict. They were that of a large, poor underclass and a very small, very wealthy, often aristocratic upper class. This division manifested itself in three areas: land ownership, the Catholic Church, and in the army. On the land, the estates were divided into two categories: minifundios, which were tiny peasant plots, and latifundios, enormous country estates. Most peasants did not even have land. By 1936, 70% of the peasants were working on land they did not own. This led to land hunger, as more peasants needed more land. The situation was supported by the Catholic Church. The Church was very influential in Spanish society. Through centuries, it had accumulated enormous wealth and held a privileged status also outside church doors. The Church controlled education, owned banks, newspapers, cinemas, and so on. Its upper clergy, especially bishops, were recruited from the noble class. Rather than trying to emancipate the poor, the Church supported conservative upper-class forces, the monarchy and the army. The second large institution within the Spanish society was the army. It was a conservative organization with mainly aristocratic officers, especially in the top ranks. The army saw itself as a privileged society within the society, being beyond criticism and public scrutiny, and being exempt from civil law. Over the decades, the officers' class had grown, so there were now one officer for every 10 men. The aristocracy refused to change this. When Manuel Azaña became head of the progressive Republican government leading Spain from 1931 to 33, 50% of the army generals were retired, along with 40% of the remaining officers. Although they were retired on full pensions, the army reacted very strongly to this, and the army can be said to have played a large part in causing and continuing the Spanish Civil War. This was because the army itself were divided in two forces: the mainland army and the Spanish Foreign Legion. General Francisco Franco, the future fascist leader of Spain, was in command in Morocco until he was transferred to the Canaries. Along with him were Generals Mola and Kindelain. They all believed that the army had the right and duty to defend the Spanish nation, even against the state itself. This army would of course support the right-wing political parties. If the left-wing government was not able to keep order, the three generals saw it as a justifiable cause for a possible invasion and military coup. The army was both a long-term and a short-term cause of the outbreak of war, as the officers were willing to, and did indeed, carry out the military coup which started the war. And they did this to preserve privileges which had for a long time widened the distance between army and society. Again, we can see parallels to 19th century Imperial Russia and Alexander II's attempts of reform. With the Emancipation Edict of 1861, the abolition of serfdom carried with it an overhaul of the army system. Also here, the officers had been of noble rank and had enjoyed extensive privileges. The reforms following the Emancipation Edict had opened up for commoners to become officers. A drastically reduced time of service, enlistment by ballot, and lesser brutality in army discipline had raised the morale and cooperation of the peasants. The Russian soldiers did stay in their positions for a long time under terribly bad conditions during World War I, suggesting that the reforms did have positive effects on the relation between army, government, and society. The Spanish army were led by upper-class officers who were themselves willing to challenge their own government. Finally, the third and last form of division was a regional one. It was a long-term course of the war. Under the Romans in 218 BC, Spain had been divided into 3 provinces, and the following millennium had only partially removed this division. The Catalonian region on the northwest coast and the Basque region on the north border in the Pyrenees considered themselves independent nations. They had their own languages and their own folklore and myths. In 1931, Catalonia had for a short time declared itself a republic, and in 1932, the Spanish government had reluctantly granted Catalonia a status of autonomy. Catalonia, with Barcelona as its capital, was responsible for 87% of Spain's industrial output. Gradually, the Catalonian people moved towards the left of the political spectrum as trade unions, socialists, communists and anarchists recruited supporters among the workers. The population hated to obey nationalist capital of Madrid in the center of Spain. The Basques, on the other hand, were nationalist. Consisting mainly of peasants, the region was deeply conservative, monarchist and Catholic. For the Basques, the tension was more one of countryside versus town. There were vast differences in the possibilities of education and employment between town and countryside. Since 70% of the peasants worked on land which they did not own, and education was very sparse, the limited opportunities manifested themselves in resentment towards Madrid, and especially Catalonia. 3 things about the divisions in Spanish society become apparent. 1. That some of these divisions were based on class differences dating back to feudal ages, such as those involving the Catholic Church, the landowning nobility, and the army. There was no middle class, and intellectually Spain was a backwater. 2. That the regional differences dating back to the Roman Empire had never been reconciled. And 3. That all the differences became entangled in new political factionalism and economic disputes with the nationalists, monarchists, conservatives, republicans, liberals, socialists, communists and anarchists, all pushing their political agendas into these centuries-old divisions. It is no wonder that at one time the lid would have to come off the boiling pot, so to speak. The question is whether the war could have been avoided if reforms had been instituted. It is doubtful. If ever we can talk of long-term causes for a war, these are them. In October 1934 came the first short-term cause. In October 1934, the Republican government led by Gilles Robles came into serious difficulties. There were 2 revolutions, one in Catalonia and one in Asturias on the northwest coast. The army restored order, but 1,300 people were killed in the fighting and perhaps 1,200 more executed afterwards. Most important, though, was the 30,000 political prisoners who were put in jail. During the next year, many of these became socialists and communists. The fronts were being drawn. The second short-term cause, or event, preceding the actual outbreak of war, was the general election held in February 1936. During this time, Gilles Robles and the CDU ran a campaign which seemed much inspired by Hitler's Nuremberg rallies. This drew many Republicans to the left, and the remaining Republicans ended in a coalition with the monarchists and agrarians. This became the National Front. On the far right of the National Front was the Falange, the fascists. In opposition was the entire left wing, socialists, communists, liberals and anarchists. Together they were known as the Popular Front. The communists had an outstanding new leader, Dolores Ibarri. Her husband had been one of the miners striking during the revolution in Asturias. Her fiery speeches earned her the nickname La Pasionara. When the election results came out, it was clear that the Popular Front had won. 278 seats in parliament against 134 to the nationalists, and only 55 to the Centre Party. What we see is an election in which the voters were drawn towards the two extreme ends of the political spectrum, leaving a vacuum in the center. The new government was a liberal one, elected in a democratic way, and would serve as the legal Spanish government from 1936 to 1939. They immediately released the thousands of political prisoners which had been in jail since October 1934. Many regular criminals were also released. Riots and social unrest occurred in both cities and the countryside. In June, 700,000 workers in Madrid went on strike. In the countryside, peasants began looting and occupying the local noble estates and attacking the local Catholic churches. All the oppressed, the workers and peasants, looked to the new government for support. From all areas of society, the contained sense of injustice now boiled over. The Republican government could not contain the situation. After the February elections, officers from the Spanish Foreign Legion began planning an officers' revolt. It was going to involve a three-pronged attack, led by generals from the Spanish Foreign Legion who would transport their armies into Spain. The southern attack would be led by General Franco, who would attack in Morocco and then move into southern Spain. The northeastern attack would come from General Godet, who would take Barcelona and subdue Catalonia. And the leader of the entire affair, General Sanjurjo, would fly in from Portugal, join General Moda, and together they would attack Madrid from the north. Franco would by then be ready to attack Madrid from the south in a pincer movement. It would all be over in a few days, and a right-wing government would be set up to restore order in Spain. A convenient excuse for the nationalist officers' revolt came on the 12th of July, when a prominent member of parliament, José Calvo Sotelo, a monarchist, was murdered. When getting ready for war, Franco asked the Italian fascist leader Mussolini for bombers and fighter planes, and Hitler for transport planes. Eventually, the African Spanish Foreign Legion would be flown into Spain in 20 Junker Ju-52 transport planes sent by Hitler. But meeting in Madrid was not going to be that easy. It would take the nationalists and the Falange 3 years of bloody battle before finally closing in on Madrid and laying it under siege. They were helped by German Nazis and Italian fascists. The Popular Front was aided by the USSR and more famously the International Brigade, a popular army consisting of 30,000 volunteers from 53 countries, fighting under the united slogan from La Pasionada, "They shall not pass." Meanwhile, peasants, workers, and anyone with a grievance would take the opportunity to settle old scores. Spain was in chaos, and in the typical tragedy of a civil war, approximately 120,000 out of the 400,000 dead were civilians. In conclusion, we see how long-term causes of internal origin and born out of centuries of discontent slowly gathered momentum until exploding in violent battle. A weak economy and an absent middle class polarized Spanish society into the few very wealthy and the many very poor. The traditional institutions, the Catholic Church and the army, sided with the noble classes, spurring discontent among peasants and workers. At the same time, Catalonia and the Basques fought for complete independence based on traditions dating as far back as the Roman Empire. It is difficult to say whether the conflict could have been avoided. When we compare to societies in a similar situation, such as late Imperial Russia, we see how Tsar Alexander II in 1861 attempted reforms on all levels. The emancipation of the serfs alleviated the pressure in Russia for a while, but not enough for avoiding the revolutions in 1905 and 1917. The question is, though, whether Spain would have avoided a civil war by distributing land among the peasants. The Republican government did grant land to about 100,000 peasants between March and July 1936, but it was probably too late. At least it did not hold back the fighting. It is important to note that the rebellion against the Spanish government was a conservative attempt at revolution against the traditional revolutionaries. This might explain the help Franco and the Falange received from Hitler and Mussolini, countered by the tanks and guns then sent by Stalin along with the International Brigade. The Spanish Civil War started on old, domestic, long-term causes, but was turned into an international battlefield of the ideologies of the day. The civilians were caught in the middle. In that sense, the Spanish Civil War bears striking resemblance to the Vietnam War a couple of decades later, and it will be worth it later to take such a comparison further.
This concludes this episode of the 20th Century Histories Series podcast. Music for the intro and outro was made by Andrea LaRose, while the music in this episode was made by Los Perdidos. To download more of these podcasts or to leave a comment, please visit www.historypodcast.net. Thank you for listening.